The Brooklyn courtroom in October 2007 held something that lawyers on both sides understood to be unusual, a case that rested almost entirely in one witness. The defendant was Roy Lindley DeVecchio, a retired FBI agent who had spent 30 years inside organized crime investigations and who was now facing 4 counts of second-degree murder, each tied to information prosecutors said he had fed to a Colombo family hitman in exchange for gifts, cash, and the kind of operational access that only a corruption of trust at the deepest level could produce. The charge, announced by Brooklyn District Attorney Charles Hines, was described as one of the worst cases of law enforcement corruption in the country's history. The indictment had been assembled, the grand jury had spoken, and the machinery of the most significant prosecution of a federal law enforcement agent in a generation was in motion. At the center of it, as she had been from the beginning, was Linda Schiro. Schiro was 62 years old when she took the witness stand. She had lived for nearly 3 decades as the companion of Gregory Scarpa, a Colombo family captain with the nickname the Grim Reaper and a body count that, by his own account to people who knew him, exceeded 50. She had been allowed into the most guarded corners of the world Scarpa inhabited. She was the only person alive who could place DeVecchio in the same rooms as the decisions that led to 4 killings. Without her, there was no case. The Brooklyn District Attorney's Office understood this and had been paying her $2,200 a month since March of 2006 for the privilege of putting her on the stand. She testified for days. Veteran reporters sitting in the gallery said DeVecchio should start planning for life behind bars. Then a journalist who had sat across from Schiro in her dining room 10 years earlier opened his notebook. What he found there, and what it meant for every word Schiro had spoken under oath, is a story about the weight that words carry across a decade, and what happens when the same person tells the same story twice in opposite directions. Drop where you are watching from in the comments below, because this story crosses 3 decades and involves a mafia hitman, a federal agent, a mob mistress, and an audio tape that no one in that Brooklyn courtroom knew existed. If you are new here and want more history like this delivered straight to you, subscribe now. Back to Brooklyn, and the woman whose own words came back to set a man free. While the Colombo crime family occupied Bensonhurst and the surrounding neighborhoods of southwestern Brooklyn, the way an institution occupies a community, woven into the fabric of daily life in ways that were understood by everyone who lived there and acknowledged formally by almost no one. It was not the largest of the 5 families that governed organized crime in New York City, and it was not the most financially sophisticated. What distinguished it was something else, a capacity for internal violence that set it apart from every other organization in the city. 3 separate wars for control of the family over 4 decades, each one producing casualties among its own members and people, unlucky enough to be nearby, marked the Colombo family's history in a way that no amount of reorganization ever fully erased. The third and bloodiest of those wars would produce 12 deaths, and would eventually reveal a corruption of federal law enforcement that altered careers and reversed convictions on both sides of the conflict. But before any of that, there was the neighborhood and the world it made possible. Bensonhurst, in the 1940s, was a working-class Italian community at the southwestern edge of Brooklyn, dense blocks of apartments and storefronts, where families who had come from the south and north of Italy had recreated social structures from the old country and sustained them across generations in the new one. The men who ran organized crime in this neighborhood were not outsiders. They were its most successful residents, men whose authority was felt without being formally acknowledged, whose prosperity operated as both advertisement and warning, and whose presence shaped the possibilities available to a young man who was paying attention to what the neighborhood rewarded. Gregory Scarpa was born in that neighborhood on May 8, 1928, to parents who had emigrated from the Veneto region of northern Italy. His father delivered coal during the Depression years, pulling the family along by physical labor, and the young Scarpa helped with this work until he was old enough to begin making different calculations. His older brother Salvatore was already connected to what would eventually become the Colombo organization. The path was not only available, it was illuminated. The qualities that would make Scarpa dangerous were not manufactured by the organization he joined. They were present before he arrived. He was physically fearless in a way that went beyond ordinary courage into something that made people around him uncomfortable. A man for whom the ordinary mechanisms of self-preservation seemed to operate below normal threshold. Associates who worked alongside him across decades described this quality consistently. Terrifying, not in the conventional sense of someone unpredictable, but in the specific sense of someone whose capacity for violence was both total and calm. He did not lose control when he killed. He was the same man before and after. He entered the organization in the early 1950s and built his reputation across the decade that followed, rising to the role of captain and chief enforcer for Carmine Persico, the man who would spend most of his adult life as the Colombo family's boss and who would eventually govern the organization from a prison cell through intermediaries and coded messages while serving what amounted to a life sentence. The relationship between Persico and Scarpa was one of the defining partnerships in the family's history. A boss who needed someone to project his authority in the most direct possible way, and an enforcer who could do that work with a consistency and completeness that Persico found irreplaceable. By the late 1950s, Gregory Scarpa had built the reputation that would follow him for the rest of his life. He was Persico's instrument, the family's most reliable means of enforcing discipline, and a man whose personal body count was already significant. He had also, unknown to virtually everyone around him, already begun to carry a secret that would define the second half of his criminal career in ways that even he, with his particular capacity for seeing outcomes clearly, may not have fully anticipated when it began. But that secret was still a year or two in the future. For now, he was simply one of the most feared men in Bensonhurst, and that for the moment was enough. In March of 1962, federal agents arrested Scarpa on a charge of armed robbery. What happened next was the product of a calculation that federal law enforcement had been making with high-value organized crime figures for years. A calculation that weighed the damage a specific individual caused against the damage that access to that individual could enable law enforcement to inflict on the organization around him. The math rarely favored the victims of the arrangement. What is documented is the outcome. Scarpa agreed to become a confidential informant for the FBI. The armed robbery charge went away. He would carry that designation for most of the next 3 decades. The FBI designated its most valuable criminal sources as top-echelon informants, a classification reserved for men with genuine access to the inner workings of the organizations they were reporting on. Scarpa earned that designation and kept it. His position inside the Colombo family, his personal relationship with Persico, and his operational involvement in the family's most sensitive activities gave him access that conventional surveillance could not replicate. He could describe the hierarchy from direct observation. He could name figures who had not yet come to law enforcement's attention. He could, in the most extreme cases, provide information that placed specific people at specific events in ways that no amount of patient external surveillance could produce. Over time, the FBI paid Scarpa $158,000 for his services. This figure represented the officially recorded payments. It did not capture the full nature of what the Bureau provided in exchange, which included protection from prosecution in cases where the evidence against Scarpa was sufficient to proceed, but where proceeding would have exposed his relationship with the government. He served 30 days in jail across the entire span of his criminal career, despite the accumulating evidence of murders and extortion and racketeering that federal authorities were aware of throughout. The arithmetic of that outcome is not difficult to interpret. The most dramatic episode in the early years of the Scarpa-FBI relationship came in the summer of 1964. 3 civil rights workers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, had disappeared in Mississippi. They were believed murdered by members of the Ku Klux Klan, and the FBI, under intense political pressure from Washington, was struggling to find the bodies and identify those responsible. Agents in Mississippi were encountering the closed silence of a community that protected its own, and conventional interrogation methods were producing nothing. Linda Schiro would testify decades later during a very different trial that the FBI recruited Scarpa to travel to Mississippi and that she accompanied him. She said Scarpa was given cash and a weapon by FBI agents, that he located a local Klansman with knowledge of the civil rights workers' fate, and that he obtained the location of the bodies through methods that federal agents could not officially employ. The three workers were found in an earthen dam. The FBI has never confirmed Scarpa's involvement in the Mississippi investigation. The relationship ran until 1975, when a dispute about Scarpa's compensation for a second Mississippi assignment broke the arrangement apart. Scarpa stopped cooperating. The Bureau lost its access to one of its most productive sources inside the Colombo family, and 5 years passed before anyone in federal law enforcement found a way back in. The agent who found that way back was named Roy Lindley DeVecchio. He had joined the FBI in 1962, the same year Scarpa became the Bureau's informant, and built his career in organized crime investigation in New York. He was, by the account of his colleagues, a careful and methodical agent with a particular gift for cultivating the kind of trust that made criminal informants willing to talk. He was also, by the time he approached Scarpa in 1980, the supervisor of the FBI squad responsible for investigating the Colombo crime family. The man investigating the family and the man informing on it were, from that year forward, the same pairing, and that pairing would last 12 years. She was a teenager living in Brooklyn in the mid-1960s when she walked into a bar and met Gregory Scarpa. The specifics of the meeting are not in the court record, but the broad shape of it is. A young woman from a neighborhood where the distinction between legitimate and criminal life was not a distinction that organized itself into clearly separated compartments, encountering a man whose status in that world was already established and whose presence was already formidable. She was young. He was experienced, feared, and, in the particular way of men who operate outside the law, compelling in ways that did not require conventional explanation. She moved in with him. The arrangement lasted 28 years, interrupted only by the periods when Scarpa was incarcerated, and it produced 2 children and a domestic life that coexisted with the criminal one in the manner such lives are conducted, by a kind of observation that is not quite the same as ignorance and not quite the same as full knowledge, but something that sits between them and takes its shape from what each person in the arrangement chooses to see and what they choose to let pass without examination. In Shiro's case, what she chose to observe was considerable. When Scarpa's FBI handler arrived for meetings, she was sometimes in the room or nearby, or able to hear through the proximity of the space. She was not hidden away. Scarpa, by her own later account, allowed her into his world in ways that went beyond what most men in his position permitted their companions. She heard conversations. She absorbed the nature of what was being exchanged. She formed, over years of these accumulating moments, a picture of what the relationship between Scarpa and his handler actually was, a picture that was quite different from what the official record of that relationship contained. The culture she lived inside was one that attached serious consequences to speaking about what you knew. The code that governed organized crime in that world was not merely a preference for discretion. It was a system of enforcement in which violations were punished by methods that made the legal consequences of cooperation seem manageable by comparison. Schiro was not a member of the organization, but she was inside it in the practical sense that mattered. She had information, and the people who would be damaged by that information were the same people whose company she kept and whose protection she depended on. She watched, and she stayed silent. For years, through the period when the events that would eventually become murder charges were occurring, she remained in the world Scarpa had built and kept what she knew inside it. Scarpa did not keep his FBI relationship secret from her. He joked about it with associates in her presence, referring to his federal handler by the nickname girlfriend, a term that captured both the intimacy of the arrangement and his own contempt for the official fiction that governed how informant relationships were supposed to work. He was not pretending to be something he was not with the people he trusted. He was a man who worked for the mob and for the FBI simultaneously, who kept both sides sufficiently satisfied to sustain the arrangement, and who found this state of affairs more useful than troubling. Schiro absorbed these realities across 2 decades of daily proximity to the arrangement. What she would eventually tell different people about what she had absorbed, and the differences between those tellings, would become the most consequential element of a case that was supposed to be about something far larger. Her first formal opportunity to answer the question of what she knew came in the early 1990s, when the world she had inhabited for nearly 3 decades began to collapse. Roy Lindley DeVecchio was born in Fresno, California in 1940, and he had built his career across the 1970s and 1980s in organized crime investigation in New York. His reputation within the Bureau was that of a careful, effective agent whose instinct for cultivating trust with criminal informants was among the best in the New York field office. He rose through the ranks to become a supervisory special agent and eventually the head of 2 organized crime squads, positions that put him at the center of some of the most consequential prosecutions the Bureau was assembling against the 5 families in their most active period. Among the most significant cases he helped build was the prosecution that would become known as the Mafia Commission case. In 1985, a federal indictment brought by the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Rudolph Giuliani, sent the heads of 3 of the 5 New York crime families to prison for life. The intelligence that helped assemble that case had come, in significant part, from Scarpa. It was the kind of outcome that built careers and institutional reputations, and DeVecchio's rose accordingly. When he approached Scarpa in 1980 about restarting the relationship that had broken down 5 years earlier, he was already in a position of significant authority. The FBI granted him special dispensation to meet with Scarpa alone, without the partner that Bureau protocol required for informant meetings. This exception, justified by the sensitivity of the source and the need to protect his identity, meant that the only record of what passed between them in those meetings was what DeVecchio chose to write down afterward in the informant documentation he maintained. Over 12 years, that documentation grew to 700 pages. The meetings took place in hotel rooms and apartments the Bureau arranged. What passed through those rooms, beyond what the 700 pages recorded, is where the prosecution's account and DeVecchio's diverge most sharply. The prosecution alleged that Scarpa provided DeVecchio with cash in rubber-banded rolls. He gave him jewelry. During the holiday season, when they were scarce and coveted, he provided a Cabbage Patch doll, a detail that captures something essential about the texture of the relationship. An FBI agent and a man with a body count in the dozens exchanging seasonal gifts with the ease of people who genuinely liked each other. Prosecutors further alleged that DeVecchio kept $66,000 in FBI funds that were supposed to have been paid to Scarpa for his services. In exchange, the prosecution's theory ran, DeVecchio gave Scarpa something far more valuable than any of it. He provided names of people inside the Colombo family who were cooperating with law enforcement. He gave advance warning of surveillance operations. He offered specific locational and behavioral intelligence about Scarpa's rivals. The girlfriend nickname that Scarpa used when referring to his handler captured the organization's general understanding of what the relationship had become, a federal agent whose loyalties, in practice, extended beyond the government that employed him. DeVecchio denied every aspect of this account. He acknowledged the closeness of the relationship, the dinners at Scarpa's home, the small gifts that passed between them. He said he had never provided information that he knew would be used to harm anyone, and that the allegation that he had crossed from managing a dangerous informant into participating in his crimes was a fabrication. The defense framing of the case was built around exactly that argument. What it could not easily address was what had happened to 4 specific people during the 12 years of the arrangement, and what Linda Schiro said about those events to different people at different times. The first death, the indictment charged to DeVecchio's account, occurred in 1984. Mary Berry was a young woman from Brooklyn who had been involved with Alphonse Persico, a son of the Colombo family's imprisoned boss, and who had come to the organization's attention because of information she possessed about people and events that the organization preferred remained private. The prosecution alleged that specific intelligence identifying her as a risk came from DeVecchio and that Scarpa acted on it. She was lured to a social club and shot in the face. Schiro would testify at trial that DeVecchio had a role in the decision to kill her. In the conversation she had with two journalists in 1997, she said something quite different about the Bari murder. 3 years later, in 1987, a Colombo soldier named Joseph De Domenico was killed. De Domenico had developed a drug habit and had, according to what Scarpa told Schiro, begun to create risks for the people around him through his unreliable behavior. The information that triggered the decision, prosecutors alleged, came again from DeVecchio. Specific knowledge that De Domenico was using narcotics, stealing from crew proceeds, and had become a liability whose continued presence endangered the organization. De Domenico was killed shortly after the alleged communication. The prosecution drew a line between the timing and the warning. The defense argued the line was invented. The third killing, involving a young man named Patrick Porco, had a particular quality that distinguished it from the others. Porco was 18 years old and had been one of the closest friends of Scarpa's son, Joey. In May of 1990, Scarpa received what the prosecution described as a warning from DeVecchio, word that Porco was about to cooperate with law enforcement about a killing that implicated Joey. What followed was swift. Scarpa arranged for Porco to be taken care of. On May 27, 1990, Patrick Porco was shot to death. He tried to block the bullets with his arms and his hands. He was 18 years old. His best friend's father had ordered his murder on the basis of what the prosecution alleged was a federal agent's tip. In the 1997 interview with the two journalists, Schiro also connected DeVecchio to the Porco killing, but she described one specific detail of how the warning was delivered differently from what she would say under oath. That smaller discrepancy, set against the far larger ones involving the other three victims, was enough to establish that the two accounts were not the same. The fourth killing was the one most directly tied to the war that was tearing the Colombo organization apart in the early 1990s. Lorenzo Lampassi was 66 years old and a member of the faction fighting against the side that included Scarpa. The prosecution alleged Scarpa asked DeVecchio for help locating him, and that DeVecchio, drawing on surveillance information his own agents had gathered, provided the details of Lampassi's daily movements, the time he left his house before dawn to lock a gate, the vulnerability that created, the hour and location his morning routine placed him. On May 22, 1992, Lorenzo Lampassi was shot to death in his driveway at 4 in the morning, at precisely the time and in precisely the location that his surveillance file would have predicted. DeVecchio was supervising the FBI squad investigating the Colombo family throughout the war. If the prosecution's account was accurate, the machinery of federal law enforcement had been directed, through his handling of Scarpa, against the very people it was supposed to be protecting. 4 killings, spanning 8 years of a 12-year handling relationship, each one occurring during the period of active contact, and the only living person who had been in and around the exchanges that supposedly preceded those killings was the woman who had shared a household with Scarpa for 28 years. In 1986, Gregory Scarpa went into Victory Memorial Hospital in Brooklyn for an emergency operation on a hiatal hernia. The surgery was routine. The aftermath was not. Scarpa refused blood from the hospital blood bank, a refusal that reflected both the anxieties of the early AIDS epidemic and a racism toward the hospital's general donor pool that other documented accounts of his behavior suggest was not incidental to his character. He arranged instead for blood from people he trusted, associates and crew members who came in and donated for the man they worked for. Among them was a bodybuilder named Paul Mele, an associate who had contracted HIV from needle use during steroid injections and who at the time of the donation had no way of knowing he was infected. Mele later died of AIDS-related complications. Somewhere in that 1986 transfusion, the virus passed to Scarpa. He did not know for some time. He continued his criminal operations, continued his relationship with the Bureau, and continued the Colombo family work that had been the structure of his adult life. The organization during this period was heading toward the most violent chapter in its turbulent history, a conflict that would not fully ignite until 1991, but that was already building through the factional tensions generated by a boss in prison and an acting boss who had grown comfortable in the role. The conflict took the shape that power struggles in closed organizations always take, gradually, and then all at once. Carmine Persico, serving an effective life sentence, had designated Victor Orena as acting boss with the expectation that the position was temporary. Orena ran the family well, and he had no intention of giving up a position that, from where he stood, he had earned. Persico wanted control returned to his family line. Orena wanted to keep it. In 1991, Persico loyalists attempted to kill Orena at his home on Long Island. He spotted the men in time and escaped. The failed assassination is the conventional starting point of what became known as the Third Colombo War. The family split into two armed factions and the systematic killing began. In November of 1991, Orena supporters ambushed Scarpa's car while his daughter and 3-year-old granddaughter were inside. Scarpa accelerated through the attack, injuring pedestrians in the process, and drove away unhurt. He was on the streets hunting members of the opposing faction again within days. By the time the war ended in 1993, 12 people were dead, including 3 innocent bystanders, and more than 80 MAID members and associates had been indicted or convicted as a consequence of the investigation that followed. The Colombo family, already weakened by years of prosecution, was left in a condition approaching organizational collapse. DeVecchio was supervising the FBI's Colombo squad throughout the entire period. The men whose locations and movements his agents were documenting were the men being killed in Brooklyn parking lots and driveways. In December of 1992, during an unrelated confrontation, Scarpa was shot through the eye. He drove himself home. He poured himself a drink. He called for an ambulance. He lost the eye. His AIDS diagnosis, following the tainted 1986 transfusion, was by this point affecting his health in ways that made continued leadership of his crew increasingly difficult. The FBI ordered DeVecchio to sever contact with Scarpa in 1992 as the legal exposure accumulated. The 12-year partnership was over. In May of 1993, Scarpa pleaded guilty to 3 murders and conspiracy to commit others. He was sentenced on December 15th of that year to life in federal prison, a sentence later reduced to 10 years in acknowledgement of his deteriorating health. He died at the Federal Medical Center in Rochester, Minnesota on June 4th, 1994, of AIDS-related complications. He was 66 years old. The Grim Reaper was dead. His secrets, or most of them, should have died with him. They did not, because several people who knew what he had been carrying were still alive and were starting to talk. The architecture of what Scarpa had been, in the full sense of both his criminal role and his federal relationship, was not designed to survive his death intact. The investigation that had put him in prison had included the cooperation of Carmine Sessa, a Colombo consigliere, who had turned government informant and who knew, from his years inside the family's leadership, that Scarpa's relationship with the FBI had been something other than what the official record described. Sessa told prosecutors about DeVecchio. He described what he understood about how information had flowed between the agent and the informant, about the protection DeVecchio had allegedly provided, about the ways in which Bureau intelligence about the Colombo family had served Scarpa rather than the investigation. The FBI took the allegations seriously enough to open a formal internal inquiry. The Office of Professional Responsibility began examining DeVecchio in 1994. The 2-year investigation reviewed the 700-page informant file, interviewed agents who had worked alongside DeVecchio, and attempted to establish whether the circumstantial connections between specific Bureau intelligence and specific criminal outcomes had been created by corruption at the handler level. Linda Schiro was among those interviewed during this period. What she told the OPR inquiry was not identical to what she would eventually say under oath in a Brooklyn courtroom more than a decade later. The specific content of those 1994 statements, documented in court records, shows her describing her confusion and discomfort with a process in which the FBI seemed to be investigating itself. The OPR itself did not find its way to a criminal referral. The investigation concluded without charges. Its findings described the relationship between DeVecchio and Scarpa as problematic and improperly close, but insufficient to support a criminal prosecution. The 19 Arena faction members who had been convicted with help from evidence assembled during the period of Scarpa's active handling were the most concrete evidence of the investigation's broader impact. One by one, as attorneys argued that DeVecchio's alleged corruption had tainted the evidence against their clients by enabling the very violence that had defined the war, those convictions were reversed or the charges were thrown out. 19 people walked away from convictions that had been built in significant part on the work of an FBI squad whose supervisor was now accused of having helped the other side. DeVecchio's reputation had survived the formal inquiry without a criminal finding against him, but it had not survived intact. In 1996, he retired. He moved to Sarasota, Florida, took on the responsibilities of president of his homeowners association, and resumed the ordinary activities of a man putting a significant career behind him. The interest in what had happened between DeVecchio and Scarpa had not faded with the OPR's inconclusive findings. Journalists who covered organized crime, federal attorneys who had handled cases touching on the Colombo family, and former participants in the world the Third War had destroyed were all carrying knowledge of what had been alleged and what had not been proven. Some of them were talking to each other. One of those conversations in 1997 involved a reporter named Tom Robbins, a journalist named Jerry Capesi, and the woman who had been inside the arrangement for 28 years. The specific question of what she had seen and what she would say about it to which audience would take years to fully resolve. The resolution, when it finally came, arrived in a form that no one in the Brooklyn courtroom had anticipated. In 1997, Tom Robbins was a reporter for the Village Voice, one of New York's alternative weekly newspapers and one of the city's sustained homes for serious investigative journalism. Jerry Capesi was, by any reasonable assessment, the most knowledgeable organized crime journalist in New York City, a reporter whose accuracy and depth of sourcing made his assessments authoritative in ways that most journalism in that subject area could not claim. The two of them had been pursuing a book about Linda Schiro and her life inside the world that Gregory Scarpa had inhabited for 3 decades. She agreed to talk to them. The ground rules she set were specific and, from her position, reasonable. The information she provided would be used only in a book, not in news articles. It would not be attributed to her by name. She also requested, in a condition that the reporters understood was her bottom line, that they would not cooperate with law enforcement inquiries that arose from anything she told them. The sessions were recorded. Robbins asked questions, and Schiro answered them at what the subsequent account of those sessions describes as her kitchen table, a setting that stood in sharp contrast to the formality of a courtroom witness box, and that had, in its casualness, produced something that formal settings often do not: a person speaking without the particular self-consciousness that comes from knowing a record is being made for legal purposes. What she said was not nothing. She described her life with Scarpa in considerable detail. She described the relationship between Scarpa and DeVecchio. She acknowledged the gifts, the meetings, the nature of what she believed had been exchanged. On the question of Patrick Porco, the 18-year-old killed in May of 1990, she connected DeVecchio to the killing in terms broadly consistent with the prosecution's later account, though she described one specific detail differently than she would at trial. On the question of the other 3 murders, what she said in 1997 was quite different from what she would say under oath a decade later. In the case of Mary Barry, Schiro told Robbins that DeVecchio had nothing to do with it. She raised the subject herself, according to Robbins' account, and was specific in her denial. In the case of Joseph De Domenico, she denied DeVecchio's involvement. In the case of Lorenzo Lampassi, she denied it again. In a recorded kitchen table conversation in 1997, Linda Schiro said that Roy Lindley DeVecchio had been involved in one of the 4 murders with which he was charged. In a Brooklyn courtroom 10 years later, She said he had been involved in all four. The book Robbins and Capeci were researching never came together. The ground rules Schiro had set remained in force through the years when the OPR investigation came and went, through DeVecchio's retirement to Florida, through the organized crime journalism that moved on to other subjects. The tapes sat in Robbins' possession for a decade. Then the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office put the case before a grand jury. Then an indictment was returned. Then the trial began, and Schiro took the stand, and the testimony she gave was the testimony that made the case against DeVecchio a plausible vehicle for a murder conviction. And Tom Robbins, sitting in the gallery of that Brooklyn courtroom, listening to her describe what she had witnessed, was also sitting with the knowledge that what she was saying now was not what she had told him 10 years earlier at her kitchen table. He had the recordings to prove it. The journey from Scarpa's death in 1994 to the indictment of DeVecchio in 2006 was not a straight line. It moved through the OPR investigation and its inconclusive outcome, through the reversal of the 19 Colombo convictions, through years of journalism about the case that kept the allegations in circulation without producing the formal legal action that would force the question. The Brooklyn District Attorney's Office under Charles Hines revisited the matter in the mid-2000s, assembled what it believed was a sufficient evidentiary basis, and presented the case to a Kings County grand jury in 2005. Schiro testified before that grand jury. Her account was the foundation of what the grand jury heard about DeVecchio's alleged role in the four killings. When the grand jury returned an indictment on March 30th, 2006, charging DeVecchio with 4 counts of second-degree murder, it did so on the basis of what she had described. The indictment covered a pattern of corruption spanning from 1984 to 1992, a 12-year period during which prosecutors alleged a supervisory special agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation had provided criminal intelligence to a mafia hitman that was used to identify and kill 4 people in exchange for gifts and cash and the cultivation of a relationship that crossed every line a federal law enforcement officer was supposed to maintain. Defense attorney Douglas Grover, a former federal mob prosecutor who knew the world he would be navigating from the inside, immediately characterized the case as what it was from the defense's perspective, a prosecution built almost entirely on the credibility of a single witness whose story had changed over time, who was being paid by the prosecution, and who had been talking to writers about a book dealing with her life. Grover told the court to follow the money. He noted that Schiro had been in contact with writers about commercial projects involving her story, and that the version of events she was providing to a prosecution that needed her account was not necessarily the version she had told before anyone was paying her to tell it. The district attorney's office continued paying Schiro $2,200 a month for her food and rent through the period of her cooperation. By the time the trial opened, she had received that support for more than a year and a half. The trial began in October of 2007 before Judge Gusten Reichbach, sitting without a jury. 8 days of prosecution testimony preceded Schiro's appearance, building context through other witnesses about the Colombo family structure, the war, and the events surrounding each killing. Then Schiro took the stand. Her testimony, delivered over multiple days, was vivid and specific, connecting DeVecchio to each of the 4 killings through direct accounts of conversations she said she had overheard between Scarpa and his handler. Veteran organized crime reporters covering the proceedings assessed the impact of her testimony in terms that consistently returned to one conclusion: it was damaging. One reporter who had covered organized crime for years told a colleague that if he were the defendant, he would be heading for an airport. Then Tom Robbins came forward, and the books became the story. The Village Voice piece that Tom Robbins published in late October of 2007 was headlined Tall Tales of a Mafia Mistress. In it, Robbins described the 1997 interview, the ground rules Schiro had set, and the content of what she had said. He described how, in that recorded conversation, she had connected DeVecchio to the Porco killing but had explicitly denied his involvement in 3 of the 4 murders the indictment charged. He wrote the line that prosecutors would spend the following day trying to recover from. What Linda Schiro was saying on the witness stand was not how she had told the story 10 years ago concerning 3 of the 4 murder counts at issue. He had the tapes. The tapes were the problem in its most irreducible form. A witness can contradict herself in a prior statement and offer an explanation. That her memory has improved over time, that fear had suppressed what she now recalled clearly, that the first account was incomplete. These are familiar defenses for a shifting testimony, and prosecutors had prepared for some version of them. What they had not prepared for was a contemporaneous audio recording of the prior account, a document that captured not just the content, but the voice, the inflection, and the absence of hesitation on precisely the points where Schiro now departed most dramatically from what she had then said. Defense attorneys learned of the tapes on the day Robbins's article appeared and immediately moved to subpoena them. Prosecutors and defense counsel listened to the recordings together in a sealed session that excluded the public and the press. What they heard produced an outcome that did not require extended deliberation. The following morning, the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office moved to drop all charges against DeVecchio. Judge Reichbach granted the motion. The hearing at which the charges were dismissed had the particular quality of a proceeding that has ended before anyone expected it to. A room organized around one outcome, reorganizing itself around a completely different one. Former FBI agents who had worked alongside DeVecchio for years had filled seats in the courthouse gallery throughout the trial. When the charges were dismissed, applause broke out in the courtroom, much of it coming from those former agents. It was the kind of applause that carried a specific meaning, not simply satisfaction at an acquittal, but relief at the conclusion of what many of them had always understood to be a prosecution that rested on foundations shakier than the district attorney's office had represented. DeVecchio stood in the well of the courtroom after the ruling. After almost 2 years, he said, "This nightmare is over. It has consumed me emotionally, drained me financially, and it has tested my faith in the system I spent 30 years of my life defending." He thanked his wife, his family, and the retired agents who had helped fund his legal defense. Brooklyn District Attorney Charles Hines told reporters that if the information about the tapes had been available to the office earlier, there would have been no prosecution. The inconsistencies were something they had not known about, he said. What neither his statement nor any other official account adequately addressed was how the prosecution had built its case around a single witness for more than a year, without discovering that the same witness had told a substantially different story on audio tape to 2 of the most prominent organized crime journalists in New York City in a recorded interview that had been sitting in a reporter's files for a decade. Judge Reichbach issued a 4-page decision at the conclusion of the proceedings. In it, he described the evidence as suggesting the FBI had made what he called a deal with the devil in its relationship with Scarpa, and that DeVecchio's handling of the informant had been, in the judge's assessment, at minimum ethically indefensible. He was explicit that this was a judgment about conduct. It was not a finding of criminal innocence. The double jeopardy clause of the Constitution meant that the charges, having been dismissed after the trial began, could not be refiled. Roy Lindley DeVecchio walked out of the Brooklyn courthouse that day and has not faced criminal charges since. Linda Schiro walked out of the same building and found herself the subject of a different kind of attention. The morning the charges were dropped, Judge Reichbach had already noted from the bench that Schiro's testimony appeared to be inconsistent with the tapes in ways that warranted serious scrutiny. He told her she might want to retain a lawyer. The assistant district attorney who led the prosecution confirmed that perjury charges were being considered. Schiro had testified under oath in a murder trial. The tapes existed. The logical next step was a perjury investigation. She gave a television interview shortly afterward in which she maintained that her courtroom testimony had been truthful. She said she was, in her own words, sick over what had happened, that she could not believe the district attorney's office had abandoned her. She acknowledged the recordings. She insisted that the differences between the 2 accounts were explainable. The monthly payments that had supported her since March of 2006 were now gone. The Brooklyn District Attorney's Office appointed a retired judge as special prosecutor to examine the perjury question. His mandate was to determine whether the inconsistencies between the 1997 tapes and the 2007 trial testimony were sufficient to support a prosecution for perjury beyond a reasonable doubt. After his examination, he concluded they were not. Perjury requires proof of intent to deceive, and the available evidence was, in his assessment, insufficient to establish that intent at the standard the law required. No charges were filed. The explanation Schiro had offered for the discrepancy was a specific one. She had not told the full truth in the 1997 interview because of the ground rules that governed that conversation. It was a book interview, not a legal proceeding. The version she gave under oath, in the setting that mattered legally, was the accurate version. If this explanation was correct, she had protected the reporter's source relationship by withholding the damning material from a kitchen table conversation, then provided it under oath when the stakes required it. If it was not correct, she had provided one account under circumstances where the consequences would be commercial, and another account under circumstances where the consequences could send a man to prison for life. Tom Robbins, in the Village Voice piece and in subsequent public statements, described his decision to come forward as the resolution of an ethical tension that had been building from the moment Schiro took the stand. He had made her a promise. He kept it for 10 years. He broke it when he concluded that keeping it was enabling what he believed to be a potential injustice, and that his obligation to the man, whose freedom depended on what the tapes contained, outweighed his obligation to the woman who had spoken under a specific set of expectations. He said a man was facing life in prison over her testimony, and he did not see how he could stay silent. The organized crime journalism world has been debating that calculation ever since. The promise was real. The testimony was also real. The gap between them was the whole problem. DeVecchio co-authored a book published in 2011 describing his career and the case in his own terms. He maintained throughout his account the innocence he had asserted from the day of his indictment. His description of the relationship with Scarpa acknowledged its closeness, acknowledged that he had walked closer to the line than bureau protocol permitted, and maintained that he had never crossed from the management of a dangerous criminal source into participation in that source's crimes. Whether that account captures what actually occurred in the hotel rooms and apartments where the meetings took place across 12 years is a question the legal system has formally declined to settle. What the collapse of the DeVecchio prosecution left behind was not resolution. It left something more difficult to carry. The specific uncertainty that attaches to a case where the failure of the legal process does not, itself, answer the underlying question. Charges dropped because the star witness's credibility was destroyed is not an acquittal on the merits. It is not a verdict. It is a procedural conclusion that closes the legal question without touching the factual one. Judge Reichbach's 4-page decision was explicit about this. His language described the relationship between DeVecchio and Scarpa as something the FBI never should have permitted to become what it became, an arrangement so far outside the formal boundaries of the handler-informant protocol that it had produced, in the judge's words, ethical horror, regardless of whether it had crossed into criminal conduct. The institutional judgment, delivered from the bench, was not exoneration. It was an adjudication of a lesser standard in a different forum. The question of what actually happened in those 12 years is therefore left to the evidence the case did not get to present, and to the competing accounts of people with obvious reasons to tell the story in ways that served their own interests. Linda Schiro had reasons to exaggerate DeVecchio's involvement if she was constructing a narrative that prosecutors needed. DeVecchio had reasons to minimize his involvement in everything the prosecution alleged. The two journalists who conducted the 1997 interview had their own relationship to the material they gathered, including the promise they made and the eventual decision about what to do with it. What the historical record does provide is a set of documented facts that exist outside all of those competing narratives. The four murders happened. Scarpa committed them or directed them. Scarpa was an FBI informant whose handler was the supervisor of the squad investigating the Colombo family at the time those murders occurred. 19 people who were convicted with evidence assembled by that squad had their convictions reversed or charges dropped after courts accepted that DeVecchio's alleged corruption had tainted what was used against them. The FBI's own internal investigation found the relationship improperly close. The judge who heard the trial agreed. Mary Bari was 25 years old. Patrick Porco was 18. Lorenzo Lampasi was 66. Joseph De Domenico was a member of a crew whose habit and behavior had made him inconvenient to the people around him. Each of them died during the period when the Scarpa-DeVecchio relationship was active. Whether information from that relationship contributed to any of their deaths is something no court has ever established. Linda Schiro ended up in the position she had occupied at the beginning, the only living person who claimed to have witnessed direct exchanges between Scarpa and his handler, holding information that no one else could verify or contradict. The special prosecutor who examined the perjury question declined to charge her, reasoning that the tapes were insufficient to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that she had lied under oath, rather than simply remembered events differently across a decade. She maintained that her trial testimony was accurate. The tapes said what they said. Cases like this one are sometimes used to argue that the informant system is structurally incapable of producing anything other than the conditions for exactly this kind of corruption, that the arrangement of tolerating criminal behavior in exchange for criminal intelligence inevitably erodes the boundaries that are supposed to protect the people on both sides of it. They are sometimes used to argue the opposite, that the intelligence Scarpa provided across 3 decades, which contributed to prosecutions including the 1985 case that sent the heads of 3 New York crime families to prison, could not have been obtained any other way, and that what he cost the people around him was the price the system charges for the access it requires. Neither of those arguments settles the question of what happened in Brooklyn between 1984 and 1992. That question remains open. Linda Shiro's tapes are the most complete documentary record of one version of the answer, and what those tapes say is not what she said under oath. That is where the story ends, which is not the same as saying it is resolved.